Something happened last night that changed the energy around this story completely. Something was left unsaid for too long, something that had been sitting quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to come into the light. And now, the message begins with words that may stop you for a moment. I have something important to tell you. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Not when everything is perfect. Something important happened today, and in this fictional spiritual story, the moment has finally arrived for the truth to be spoken. You may have felt that something was different before you even knew why. Maybe the day seemed strangely quiet. Maybe a thought appeared in your mind and refused to leave. Maybe you suddenly remembered someone, a conversation, a place, or a moment from the past that you thought you had already moved beyond. Sometimes the heart notices a change before the mind can explain it, and that is where this story begins. Imagine that somewhere beyond your ordinary routine, someone has been carrying words they could not find the courage to say. They have replayed conversations in their mind. They have wondered what would happen if they finally stopped hiding behind silence. They have asked themselves whether the truth would bring peace or create another question. But today, something happened. Something made them realize that remaining silent was becoming harder than speaking. For a long time, they may have convinced themselves that waiting was safer. They could wait until the timing felt right. They could wait until circumstances changed. They could wait until they understood their own feelings better. They could wait until fear became smaller, but fear does not always become smaller by waiting. Sometimes, it grows, and eventually, a person reaches a moment when they realize that the things they leave unsaid can become heavier than the things they are afraid to say. That moment has arrived in this story. The words are simple: I have something important to tell you. But behind those words is an entire history of hesitation. There was a time when this person believed they could simply ignore what they felt. They thought that if they stayed busy enough, surrounded themselves with enough distractions, and avoided difficult conversations, everything would eventually settle down. Instead, the questions became louder. Why does this person still matter? Why does the memory keep returning? Why does the unfinished conversation still feel unfinished? Why does the thought of finally telling the truth feel frightening and relieving at the same time? And most importantly, why did something happen today that suddenly made silence impossible? That is the mystery at the center of this message. The important event does not have to be something dramatic in the outside world. Sometimes the biggest turning point happens quietly inside a person. A realization. A moment of honesty. A memory that suddenly makes sense. A conversation with someone else that forces them to see their own situation differently. Maybe they heard a song that reminded them of a chapter they thought was closed. Maybe someone mentioned your name. Maybe they passed a familiar place. Maybe they found something they had forgotten. Maybe they simply sat alone for a few minutes and realized they were tired of pretending that everything was fine. Whatever caused the realization, something shifted, and when something shifts inside a person, the story can never remain exactly the same. This is why the message feels urgent, not because you should panic. Not because you need to assume that a mysterious event is definitely happening in your real life, but because the fictional story is reaching the moment when hidden feelings can no longer remain hidden. The person in this story has something to explain, and they know that once they begin, there may be no easy way to return to silence. They have imagined this conversation many times. In one version, they say everything perfectly. In another, they become nervous and forget half of what they wanted to say. Sometimes they imagine you understanding immediately, other times, they imagine you asking questions they are not prepared to answer, and that fear has kept them quiet, but today was different. Today, something made them understand that waiting for perfect circumstances was just another way of avoiding the truth, so they began with the only words they could manage: "I have something important to tell you." Those words may sound small, but they carry enormous weight, because whenever someone says something is important, the mind immediately asks, "What happened?" And that question is exactly where the suspense begins. What happened today? Why did it change their perspective? What truth have they been carrying? Why have they waited this long? And why does it feel as though everything is finally moving toward one conversation? The answer begins with something they finally admitted to themselves. They admitted that they had been confused. Not necessarily about another person, another relationship, or another situation. They were confused about themselves. They did not know what they truly wanted. They did not know how to express what was happening inside them. They did not know whether they were ready to face consequences that might come from being honest. Sometimes people are not silent because they have nothing to say. Sometimes they are silent because they have too much to say. Every sentence opens another question. Every truth reveals another truth beneath it. And that is exactly what happened here. The first realization was followed by another, then another. Until finally, the person understood that they could not keep treating the situation like something that would disappear on its own. They had to face it. They had to speak. And so, in the story, the message continues: I need you to understand something before you judge me. I know I have been quiet. I know there were moments when you deserved an explanation and I didn't give one. I know silence can feel like rejection, and I understand why you might have interpreted it that way. But the truth is, silence was never the complete story. Those words reveal the first crack in the wall, because silence can create stories of its own. When someone does not explain themselves, the other person may fill the empty spaces with assumptions. Maybe they stopped caring, maybe they moved on, maybe something changed, maybe the connection was never meaningful. But sometimes the truth is more complicated. Sometimes someone withdraws because they are overwhelmed. Sometimes they become distant because they are afraid of making the wrong decision. Sometimes they need time to understand themselves before they can communicate honestly. That does not automatically make every silence acceptable. It simply means that silence can have many explanations, and in this fictional story, the explanation is finally coming. I was afraid, the message continues. I was afraid that if I told you what was really happening inside me, everything would become real. As long as I stayed quiet, I could keep pretending that I still had control. But today I realized something. I don't have control over everything that I feel, and pretending otherwise has only made things harder. The story pauses there, because there is a difference between having feelings and knowing what to do with them. A feeling is not a command, a thought is not a promise, a connection does not automatically determine the future. Real life requires communication, boundaries, respect, patience, and choices. But within this fictional spiritual story, the important moment is not about predicting the future. It is about the courage to stop hiding behind uncertainty. That is what happened today. Someone finally decided that honesty was more valuable than pretending, and perhaps that is why the words "open this right now" carry so much emotional power. They represent a moment when someone has finally stopped running from an uncomfortable truth. They have realized that every unanswered question has been taking up space. They have realized that every unfinished conversation has remained unfinished because nobody was willing to take the first step, and now, the first step has been taken, but there is another layer. The person has something important to tell you, but they are also beginning to understand something important about themselves. They realize that they cannot ask another person to give them certainty they have not created within themselves. They cannot expect someone else to fix every fear. They cannot expect the past to disappear simply because they finally speak. They must take responsibility for their own choices. That realization changes the entire tone of the story. This is no longer just about romance or destiny. It is about maturity. It is about recognizing that meaningful connections require honesty. It is about understanding that if someone truly values another person, they must eventually communicate rather than leaving everything trapped inside their own thoughts, and that is why the message continues to unfold. I don't want to give you a perfect story, the person says. I want to give you the truth. Those words are powerful because the truth is rarely as polished as imagination. The truth can be awkward. The truth can be complicated, the truth can contain regret, the truth can contain uncertainty, but the truth can also bring freedom, and perhaps that is what happened today. Freedom from pretending, freedom from constantly replaying the past, freedom from wondering what might happen if the conversation finally occurred. There is still fear, though. The person knows that. Honesty does not guarantee the response they want. That may be the hardest part. You can tell the truth and still not control what happens next. You can apologize and still need to give someone space. You can explain yourself and still have to accept another person's boundaries. You can care deeply and still understand that another person gets to make their own decisions. That is the lesson hidden beneath the dramatic message. The important event today was not necessarily an external miracle. It was the realization that honesty has to come before expectation. And now the person is ready to say what they have been holding back. I remember more than you think. They remember the little moments, the conversations that seemed ordinary at the time, the moments when they felt understood, the moments when they laughed unexpectedly. The moments when they noticed something about the other person that they never forgot. Memory has a strange way of preserving what mattered. Years can pass. Circumstances can change, people can grow, yet certain moments remain vivid because they became part of the emotional history of a person's life. That does not mean destiny has written every detail of the future. It means human beings remember what matters to them. And this person has been remembering. That is what they finally admitted today. They realized that they had been carrying an unfinished chapter, not necessarily because they were meant to force it open, but because they had never honestly acknowledged what it meant to them. And once they acknowledged it, something became clear. They needed to communicate, not through hints, not through assumptions, not through mysterious signs, through words, real words, clear words, honest words, so the message becomes even more direct. I don't expect you to forget everything that happened. I don't expect you to trust me instantly. I don't expect you to have the perfect response. I only want the chance to tell you the truth without hiding behind fear. There is something deeply human about that request, because everyone has moments when they wish they could go back and explain themselves. Everyone has said something badly. Everyone has stayed silent too long. Everyone has misunderstood someone. Everyone has wondered what might have happened if they had simply been brave enough to speak. But life does not allow us to rewrite every moment. What it sometimes gives us is another opportunity to communicate differently. That is what this story is about. A second chance does not mean repeating the past. It means learning from it. And today, that lesson finally became impossible to ignore. The person realized that waiting had not made the situation disappear. Instead, waiting had made the question larger, so they decided to stop asking themselves, "What if?" and start asking, "What can I honestly say now?" That question changed everything. The answer was not a grand speech, it was simple: I cared more than I admitted. Those words may be the most important part of the entire message, because sometimes people hide behind indifference when they are actually protecting something vulnerable. They act unaffected, they pretend not to notice, they tell themselves they are completely fine, but privately, they are still processing what happened. This does not excuse poor behavior. It does not erase mistakes. It does not guarantee that everything will work out. It simply explains why the conversation had to happen. The truth needed a voice, and now that voice has finally appeared. I should have spoken sooner. That sentence carries regret, but regret can become useful when it teaches someone to behave differently. The past cannot be changed, but the next decision can. The next conversation can be more honest. The next boundary can be clearer. The next choice can be more thoughtful. And perhaps that is why this moment happened today instead of yesterday. The person was not ready yesterday, but today, something changed. Maybe they finally understood what they had been avoiding. Maybe they realized that time does not automatically solve every problem. Maybe they understood that another person deserves clarity rather than confusion. Whatever happened, the result is the same. They are ready to speak. And there is one final truth they have been afraid to say. I don't know exactly what the future looks like. But I know I don't want fear to make my decisions anymore. That sentence changes the story from prediction to possibility, because nobody can know every detail of tomorrow. No one can guarantee how another person will respond. No one can promise that every relationship will become what people hope it will become. But people can choose honesty. They can choose respect. They can choose patience. They can choose to communicate instead of assuming. And that is where the message becomes meaningful. If you are imagining yourself inside this fictional story, remember that you are not required to accept every promise simply because someone finally speaks. Listen carefully, ask questions, protect your boundaries, pay attention to actions as well as words. A powerful message is not powerful because it tells you what must happen. It is powerful because it reminds you that you deserve clarity. The person in this story has finally reached that understanding. They no longer want to hide behind vague signals. They want to communicate directly. They want to explain what happened today. And now comes the final revelation. Something happened that reminded them that life moves quickly. A conversation, a realization, a sudden change of perspective, or simply the passing of another day made them understand that there is no perfect moment to tell the truth. There is only the moment when you decide to stop avoiding it. That was today. That was the turning point. That was the reason the message begins with those urgent words, "I have something important to tell you." And perhaps the most important thing they have to say is not about what happened last night. It is about what they understand now. They understand that connection without communication becomes confusion. They understand that feelings without honesty become fear. They understand that memories without acceptance can keep people trapped in the past. They understand that caring about someone does not mean controlling their choices. They understand that love, friendship, trust, and every meaningful connection require respect, and most importantly, they understand that truth should not be delayed forever simply because it is uncomfortable. So if this story had one final message, it would be this: do not let mystery become your only explanation. Do not build an entire future around assumptions. Do not allow fear to speak louder than honesty. If someone has something important to tell you, let them communicate clearly, and if you have something important to say, choose honest words when the moment is appropriate. Because sometimes the biggest change begins with one simple sentence: I need to tell you the truth. And tonight, in this fictional story, that sentence has finally been spoken, the silence has been broken, the hidden thoughts have reached the surface, the question that remained unanswered for so long has finally been placed into the open. But there is still one thing left. The person takes a breath. They know this is the moment they have imagined over and over. They know that once the next words are spoken, there is no returning to the version of the story where nothing was said. And then they finally reveal what they have been trying to explain all along. I was never trying to make you feel forgotten. I was trying to understand myself. I know I handled things imperfectly. I know silence created questions. But today I realized that if something matters, it deserves honesty. So I am finally telling you what I should have told you before. And the story ends there. Not because everything has been solved, but because the truth has finally been given a chance to breathe. The next chapter cannot be forced, it has to be chosen, and whatever happens next, one thing has changed forever. The silence is no longer carrying the entire story. Now there are words. Now there is clarity. Now there is a choice. And sometimes, the most important thing that happens in a single day is not the event everyone notices, it is the quiet decision inside someone to finally stop hiding from the truth. That is what happened today. That is why the message began with, "I have something important to tell you." And that is why this moment matters, because the story was never really about a mysterious prediction, it was about the courage to communicate. It was about realizing that the heart can hold memories, questions, hopes, and regrets for a long time, but eventually, honesty has to find a way out. Tonight, the door has opened, the conversation can finally begin, and what happens after that is not written in stone. It depends on honesty, it depends on choices, it depends on respect, it depends on whether both people are willing to listen, understand, and grow. The important thing is that the truth is no longer trapped behind silence. Something happened today, a realization happened, a decision happened, and in this story, that decision changed everything. The message has finally been delivered. I have something important to tell you. Now the silence is over, and the next chapter begins with the truth. The moment the silence finally broke, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling the relief they had imagined, your soulmate suddenly realized that telling the truth was only the beginning. The words had been spoken, but the meaning behind those words was much deeper than either of you expected. There were still memories they had never explained, decisions they had never justified, and emotions they had pushed aside because facing them felt too difficult. They looked at the situation differently now, not through fear, not through pride, not through the stories they had created in their own mind. They began looking at it through honesty, and that was when another realization appeared.